And
What's the cheese?
yeah, so very good, very good. I like it already, Sammy. So I wanted to tell the experience that my parents had had, and this means that your mom, your grandma, sitting right over here, her mom and dad were the very first people in our family to become Mormons, and that is an amazing thing because we grew up and lived on an island out in the Atlantic Ocean. Most people don't even know where Nova Scotia is. And I always say, do you know where Anne of Green Gables took place? And I'm like, oh yeah, I know all about Anne of Green Gables. Okay, well it was the island right next to Anne of Green Gables. And they're like, oh yeah, great. So anyway, so my parents were both natives of the island of Cape Breton, and my mother grew up in a very wealthy family, and her parents were very religious, and my mother became a nurse, and she was a really good nurse too. In fact, she was voted the nurse with the best bedside manner when she graduated from school. And she met my dad, who was just had graduated as an engineering. He had his degree in mechanical engineering, and they met. They were married, and they came back to Nova Scotia, to Cape Breton Island in particular, to Sydney, which is a big steel city, and that's where they would make all kinds of things like rails and nails and wire for all these and for things for big buildings. And my dad was over a big department in the Sydney Steel Corporation, and we had kind of a charmed life. I was the oldest of 5 children, and then I had a brother, John, who was 2 years younger than me, and another brother, Stuart, and then your mom came along, and
Grandma.
well, yes, yeah, your grandma, pardon me, I keep going, your grandmother came along, and there was, 8 years difference between us, and then we had a younger brother after that. So anyway, in the midst of all of that, my mother was a kind of nurse that took care of people at night. So while you guys would be sleeping, while we were sleeping, my mom would go off to work. And usually she would take care of not just a whole bunch of people, but one person. And usually the person was very ill and old. And so my mom, her job was to sit with them through the night and just make sure that they were safe and they were breathing and everything was okay while their family went to sleep. So one time, and more than once, my mom would be sitting with an old person who was very ill. And around 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, sometimes they would pass away. They would die. And there was nobody there except my mother and the person who had been very sick. And that happened a bunch of times, and my mom said that a lot of times it seemed like just before somebody died that there would be somebody in the room that this person, this sick person in bed, would be talking to. And it was like someone they knew and someone that they were carrying on a conversation with. And she thought, wow, how could that be? And like, who are they talking to? There must be like somebody else. There must be like someone like watching over you, or there must be something else about life that we just don't understand. So afterwards, after having that experience a bunch of times, my mom started thinking, I'm going to find out, because she used to be a Sunday school teacher in St. Andrew's Church for a while, and she was always a very religious person. My dad not so much, but he was a really good man. But so even though we would still go to church, she would be checking out all these other churches, and sometimes we'd go to Seventh-day Adventist things or Billy Graham kind of rallies, and they'd have the call to, what is it, the altar call or whatever, you'd come up and anyway, I had lots of experiences with my mom. We'd be going to different churches, trying to find a church that would explain why it was that maybe there was like a spirit or something that comes to see you just before you pass away. So, with that in mind, one summer, my brothers and I were out playing on the front street, and where we lived, everybody lived like in the same house their whole life. Nobody ever moved away. So it'd be like if you lived in this house and then you never moved away. He just stayed here until he went to college. So we knew each other really, really well. So all the kids were out playing out front one summer day, and I was about 11, and I looked down the street. A whole bunch of us looked down the street, and here were two men coming down the street. The young men, they had black suits on and dark hats. We thought, that can't be very good. They looked like they were up to mischief. And we could see that they were going from house to house, but they weren't getting in anybody's house. So all of us ran and scattered and went to our separate homes, and we said to our parents, because back then everybody had moms that were still at home taking care of the house. I remember going in and telling my mom, don't open the door. There are two guys coming down the street, and I just don't think, it's very safe. Don't open the door for them. And my mom was kind of a free spirit. You know what that means to be a free spirit? She pretty much did whatever she wanted to do. Isn't that true? She said, well, we'll just see. So when they came and knocked on the door, she let them in. And they came down and sat down in the living room, and they were two Mormon missionaries. And they started talking to her about just various things. They wanted to give her a Book of Mormon, and they started talking about how, the plan of salvation, like we lived before we came and that we will live again after we die. And she was like, wow, you know what? This is the kind of message I've been looking for all these years. And so she told them to come back. And she said she wanted to keep the Book of Mormon. And so I remember that evening, Dad came home from work, and my mom told him, she said, there were two young men that came to our house, and they gave me a Book of Mormon, and they told me, that they had a message for us, and do you mind if I have them come back and I'll learn more about this? And my dad was like, fine, go ahead, Jean, do whatever you want. He said those boys had come to a Wiseman dinner or banquet or something earlier, and my dad said, they're just really nice fellas, but if you wanna bring them in and listen to their story, go ahead, but I'm not interested. So anyway, long story short, my mom started having these young missionaries come to our home. Elder Jenks and Elder John, that's their name, I'll always remember that. And so they started giving us missionary lessons, and they'd have like a flannel board thing where, you put things up on flannel, and it was pretty fun. And explaining about, that we had a Father in heaven, and that he was really our Father, our Heavenly Father, and that we were really his children, and that he loved us, and that when we left this world, that we would go and live again as families. And there were just a lot of wonderful messages, and it made my mom realize that we lived as spirits, and that probably when people were dying, they had someone come from the other side to kind of bring them back home. So, long story, even shorter, my mom got baptized. And I think, as I recall, they baptized her in the swimming pool at the YMCA, as I recall. And we started, but even before she was baptized, we would go to church. But the interesting thing was, church wasn't like a regular church. It was like a hall that was about it was 3 stories up, but 2 stories above a shoe store on the main street in town. So on the back side, you're overlooking the harbor. So you have to open the door by the shoe store, and there was all these other stores. You'd go up like about 2 or 3 flights of stairs, just straight up. So you had to be in pretty good shape, or you couldn't even go to church. It was pretty. And then you'd come in, and there would be this big hall, and there were black curtains that were draped over all the pictures of, I guess, people who had died. It was kind of a really dreary, kind of spooky place. So you'd have to kind of sweep all the cigarette butts off the floor, and then you just have a little corner of the room where they pushed in a piano, and there was just, at the time when we went, there was only Mrs. McLeod, I remember that, and her daughter, Shauna. And those were the only people in church, the missionaries. And I remember going with my mom, and my brothers were like, boy, this is hardly not even like church at all. This is like something else. But you know what? The message was true. And what the missionaries were saying was absolutely right. And so in time, after my mom was baptized, we kept going to church, and my dad started going with us. And so he really liked the missionaries, so we'd have them come for dinner and all kinds of things like that. And so the years went by, and my dad he was just a wonderful guy. He knew he was buddies with all the missionaries. He thought, you know what, I just don't understand the Joseph Smith story. I just don't know how, like a boy that was only 14 years old, how could Heavenly Father speak to somebody like that young, you know? He just said, I don't buy it. And so even Truman Madsen, who was our mission president, who you wouldn't know, but he would come to Sydney, to our little branch, and he would talk to my dad about how the Book of Mormon was absolutely true, and Joseph Smith really was a boy prophet. And my dad would argue with him, which was so embarrassing, but nonetheless. So here it is. Now I am going on 16 after all these years, like 4, and I was baptized when I was 12, and my brother's backtracking a little bit, in the chapel in Dartmouth, just outside of Halifax, in Nova Scotia. And so anyway, now I'm 16, and my dad is still not a member. And one summer, they were having a youth conference in down, was it Amherst? I think it was. I think Amherst College. And they had asked all the youth from all along the eastern seaboard to come down and have this big youth conference. They were going to have a dance, and at the time, Truman Madsen was leaving, and Boyd K. Packer was coming in as the new mission president. And so they were kind of celebrating all of that. And so my mom and dad were asked to be chaperones to bring down the youth from our area. Well, basically it was just me and my brothers, and we were the ones that went. So we got down there and we had an amazing time. We had so much fun. And my dad, who was really a lot of fun, and you would have really liked him, Sammy and Owen, because he would tell funny stories. And when we were there, he was trying to teach us how to dance the peppermint twist, which was a brand new dance that had just come out. So that Saturday night, they had a singing group, the 3Ds, and they were singing all the popular songs, and my dad was out there trying to show everybody how to dance the latest dances. So the next morning, we went to a little chapel on campus, and it was all filled with mostly young people, just like ourselves, teenagers, and their chaperones. And Truman Madsen and Boyd K. Packer both stood up and, after the meeting got underway, bore their testimonies about the truthfulness of the church, and that we were so fortunate to be members. And then they opened it up and they turned it into a huge testimony meeting. And so they had a microphone, and they would pass the microphone around and let people, bear their testimony like you see in church. And it was just really, really powerful. I told, Elder Chanel, I said, it was just electrifying. I don't know when I've been in a testimony meeting when it was so powerful. And I was sitting right next to my dad, and my dad, I could see, even though he was always very academic, and he was a lot of fun, and he could get emotional about things, but not necessarily about church things. But I could see that he was really kind of tearing up over some of the things that people were saying. And so when the meeting was over, and I was so just touched by what people were saying, my dad stood up and he said, I have been fighting this all these years, but now I know, he said, I can't deny what I felt in the meeting today, he said, and the church is definitely true. We're like, what? This is like the shock of all shocks. And we're like, Dad, really? This is amazing. And so I don't know if it was my mom or someone told the missionaries, he said, you know what? Bill Dodson has decided, he wants to get baptized. He said he knows the church is true. He just knows it. And so they hurried and told Truman Madsen that very morning, and he said, get that man in the water before he changes his mind. And so that afternoon, we drove to the Boston Stake Center, and he was baptized that afternoon at the Boston Stake Center. And my parents stayed active their whole lives. We're sealed in the temple later on, and so it was an amazing miracle. And what does that tell you? You can study and, learn things, but in the end, the Spirit speaks to your heart. Not just to your mind, but to your heart. So that's the story.